today's the last day you can bid on it. It's the last day that you can bid on the 1986 Hand of God ball that Diego Maradona put in the World Cup quarterfinal. And it's nothing special about the particulars of that kind of deflated-looking, decades-old ball, but the story around it that makes it a requirement that you would need about 3 million of your spare dollars to place a bid on it. In that quarterfinal game, Argentinian footballer Diego Maradona was seen by some to be punching the ball into the goal. Against the English defenders, they went back and forth on it. He looked over his shoulder to see how the ref was going to call it. And in the end, that goal counted. But some say it was a legal goal by a great player. Others say it was one of the biggest faults in refereeing that has ever happened. And some say, trying to walk that line in the middle, that it was the head of Maradona, but the hand of God that put that ball into the goal. They all saw the same event, but you walked away with different ideas of what happened. It's no different than any other type of sports, though. Sports commentators have the same game to watch. They have the same stats as you do, and yet as you listen to them, one tells you how great your favorite team is, followed by the next one who says that they have no chance of winning. Competing and conflicting ideas from watching the same thing. Now, you can go back and watch that 1986 Cup final and see what probably confirms what you were already going to think about that goal. So that blurry footage would be there to support what you already know. So in the 21st century, in the last World Cup, the inclusion of stats upon stats, of VAR, and showing how you can be offside with just a toe means we still are disagreeing on what we see happen in sports. More data does not make it any clearer, but makes us maybe a little more perturbed at how the game is called. Many people say what they want, but in the end, no matter what people say, it's always what the referee puts in that gets on the score sheet. Daily, we're navigating conflicting and competing answers on how to put together life. Sometimes it's easy to pair them next to each other and there's no conflict. Sometimes they're perplexing to try and hold them in tension with each other, and sometimes it's just flat out impossible to call both of these things the right way to view it. In the end, we have to find one reality that we believe in, not just surveying what people say. And that's what Jesus challenges his disciples with today. He starts with an easier question, the survey type of question. Who do people say the Son of Man is? And if you're one of the disciples, you know that the Son of Man is that title from Daniel 7 that Jesus really likes to point back towards himself. So it's not trickery that he's asking a follow-up about who he is. The disciples know that he calls himself the Son of Man. The Son of Man, the judge on the final day with the Ancient of Days who reckons all things for all people. Quite a big title. So he asks his disciples, who do they say, what are they saying about this title? Well, some say it's John the Baptist, continuing his ministry. Some say it's Elijah back and completing his work. Others say it's Jeremiah, the prophet who wanted to get the land back. And he prophesied on how that land was coming back into God's kingdom. Or other prophets with their various promises attached. They know what he's asking. And it's at this point that the disciples are pressed with a harder question. Who do you say I am? Jesus asking them directly, not for the survey, not for all the options, but what do you believe? A much harder question. And so, the disciples are silent long enough for Simon to step forward and answer. You know, Simon, the one who always talks first, who, as I heard talking with a parishioner this weekend, he's the one who always opens his mouth and inserts his foot. He's always the one quick to jump in and talk first and maybe think about it later. You know, Simon. He comes up and says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And it's at this point that the text turns, because the story starts with Simon and Jesus, but it becomes Peter and Christ that end the story. This isn't the first time that this type of change happens as we're tossing names and titles around. No, this is actually a great reason that we have our Old Testament reading. So we'll put a pin in the gospel for a minute, and we'll come back to it. Let's go to Isaiah, where he says, look back to Abraham and Sarah. Except the story doesn't start with Abraham and Sarah. No, the story starts with Abram and Sarai. And there's two important facts about Abram and Sarai. They're God-fearing couple, and they have no kids. So when God's promised to make them the father of many nations, for them to be continuing that promise from the Garden of Eden, well, it's a lot to believe in. It's a lot to believe in that promise. And God knows this. He actually does something more than just giving them a promise. He gives them a new identity so that they're constantly reminded about God's promise to them. The story is no longer about Abram and Sarai. The story is about Abraham, the father of many nations, and Sarah. And as you look, that's exactly how Isaiah talks about them. Even when he was just one, God called him. But he doesn't call him Abram at that time. He calls him Abraham, the name that's connected to the promise. Even as they look back and recount before God's promise was applied, they use the gracious name that God gave them, the identity that connects them to that promise. And God does the same for you. He does the same when he renames you. And we jump back into our gospel reading to figure out exactly how that happens, because the disciples are now trying to answer who exactly Jesus is, and we're ending the story with both of the characters being renamed. No longer are Simon and Jesus talking. No, it's Peter and the Christ. Just like Abraham and Sarah, they are now given the following qualities. They're blessed and renamed by the promises. Because that's what Jesus does. He points back to Simon Peter and says, "Blessed are you, Simon. Here's your new name." And he's blessed because God reveals this to him. God has revealed this truth about Jesus being the Christ. It wasn't Simon and the disciples as a good panel of sports commentators looking at the same thing we do and reading through the text and going, it must be Jesus the Christ, the Son of the living God. You know, that's exactly what I came up with. No, God reveals this to them. He graciously gives them the plan of how he's helping them, how he's giving them all these promises. And after he's given that promise, revealed it to him, he brings it even closer and gives a new identity to those who are bound by the promise. You are Peter. Renamed to constantly remember who you are. And this is a big point in Matthew's gospel. We're at a turning point in the text. Jesus is publicly called inside this group the Christ, the Son of the living God. Next week, you come and you'll hear Pastor Sam preach about how Peter and Jesus had a little disagreement on what the mission of Christ was. But today we see that the mission of Christ is because he's got that title. And Christ is there to go to the cross, to fulfill the promises. Christ is that Greek name that's given, but if we were to say it in Hebrew, we would call him the Messiah. And the Messiah is very tied to the Old Testament as someone who will fulfill promise after promise. Promise after promise to people like Abraham and Sarah. Promise after promise to the disciples and Peter and James and John as they walk around with Jesus. The Messiah who fulfills promises given to the church century after century. That's who they're saying Jesus is. And it's at that point that the gospel turns. After this text, we're moving towards the cross. Not by accident, but on purpose. Jesus calls out that his passion is coming after this moment, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And the third time, he makes it a little plain for his disciples, saying, we're headed to Jerusalem. He calls exactly where they're going to be. Exactly where the Christ fulfills his mission. Exactly where promises are fulfilled. And it's that phrasing that we hear today, the Christ, the Son of the living God, that Matthew is very careful to only repeat when it's next necessary. This construction only comes up again in Matthew 27, when we hear it as the charge against Jesus from the Jewish leaders. The charge that ultimately is there to put Jesus up on the cross that Friday. It's intentional. Jesus is intentionally going where he wants to go. He's intentionally fulfilling promises, and along the way, he's attaching names to those who believe in it. And this is what the church speaks. Not just what people say about Jesus, not the survey of what you can hear, but a definitive answer on who Jesus is, the official record for the score sheet. Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, the promise fulfiller. But the church doesn't stop there. No, the church has more to say about who you are, because you are someone who believes in the promise, and you are blessed because God has revealed this to you. God's opened your eyes to faith that he's created out of nothing you could do. And to remind you of that, you're renamed. We might not see it a lot in baptisms we have now, but God renames you in that baptism. In the Roman times, as the church was converting to Christianity, the Roman world was doing baptism after baptism in the 3rd and 4th centuries. You would come up to the baptism font and you'd be asked this question that we still have in our liturgy. How are you named? And if you were walking up with one of your buddies to be baptized, you might actually be surprised at what they answer. Because many people changed their names as they got baptized. They got rid of that definition of the old Adam, who they were, that old sinful name, and they wanted to be reminded of the name that was connected to the promises. The promises that God has in baptism. Day after day. Week after week. And we get reminded of those things as a New Testament church too. We're blessed and renamed. That identity connected to a promise is constantly retraced over us as we make the sign of the cross in the remembrance of our own baptism. But it doesn't stop there. The church speaks more about what the world needs. The church speaks that forgiveness is intentional, not by accident. That we don't accidentally get there to sins being forgiven for that you being made right with God simply by omitting or skipping over the ways that we fall short. No, instead, we think of Abraham and Sarah, the ones who were given the promise, and like a rock cut out of a cliff, are destined to be put back in there. We look back to the rock from which we were cut out, to the bedrock of promises that God has given century after century, and we realize that that forgiveness is there for you, and it's there intentionally. Jesus fulfilled the promises so that this would be an additional part of that bedrock of promises for you. That you can scour across the Bible and see how God's been faithful. So that you can confess out to the world, forgiveness is there for you, and I know it for sure. Confessing alongside Peter that the Son of the living God is who we believe in, and that Christ, the Son of the living God, comes down every time he gives out a promise, in preached word, in water connected to his word, and when his word is connected with wine and bread. Because gospel-led churches say the gospel. They say the promises that God has given us, and they say them surely, not as one voice among many, but as the official record of God being faithful. Saying clearly that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and that he is a promise fulfiller offering forgiveness to you. Saying the gospel. That's what the church gets to speak. Time in, time again, over and over, no matter what people say, the official record is this: Jesus died for you. That's it. The church speaks and says a very simple and very clear thing. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.